All right, class, this is the last section that we're going to do in our book before the final. And so, all of chapter 12, we've been talking about how to solve quadratic equations. Now, we started out back in chapter 5. We reviewed chapter 5 a little bit. And so we've talked about 4 different methods that we've learned from solving quadratic equations. So, method number 1 was back in chapter 5. We learned how to solve by factoring and our zero product property. We learned in section 12.1 how to solve when we have perfect squares. In 12.2 we saw how to solve by completing the square. And in section 12.3 we learned how to solve using quadratic formula. So the question is, what to do when? How can we put it all together today and realize how to solve quadratic equations? Well, I am going to give you one little hint here. If you look at my exclamation point, you can use the quadratic formula to solve any quadratic equation in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, but one of the other methods may be easier. So the question is, how do you decide which method to use? Well, I've come up with a little chart to help us. If you look here, here's our 4 different methods. Quadratic formula. And again, you can use quadratic formula for everything, but it has to be in standard form. So it has to be equal 0. Now, factoring. Look at this sequencing on number 2. Do you see here, if you pay attention, I'm missing a constant term, and really, we're just looking for the GCF. If we can see a GCF, then we can go right to factoring. Remember, rule number 1 is factoring, was to find the GCF, and we continue on. When we get to step 3, we said properties of square roots. If you notice, the only variable I have there is an x squared. So we're going to solve by square roots. And then last but not least is completing the square. I would use completing the square if I can't factor and b is even. If that number in front of the x is even, then completing the square. So let's see how that correlates to what we're going to do on our quiz tomorrow. So if you look at number 1, well, if I look at number 1, what would be the best way for me to solve that equation? Well, when I look at number 1, as soon as I see that b is 5, I am not going to complete the square. Because remember, we said that's going to give me that b over 2 squared, which is a fraction, so I don't want to go there. So when I look at number 1, we could factor. Okay, we could factor, or we could use, I'm going to say QF for quadratic formula. Either one of those would work. Now, factoring is going to be my best option. It's my easiest option. And again, remember how to factor? We would say factors of x squared are x and x. We would look at our signs, and we've got the first is plus and the second is minus, so that means I need one of each. Okay, so now I need factors of 6. Is it going to be 1 and 6 or 2 and 3? Well, it's going to have to be 1 and 6. We do plus 6, and minus 1. And then we would x factor to see if we've chosen wisely. We've got negative 1x plus 6x. We've chosen wisely. So now we make each part equal 0. And then here we get x equals negative 6 and x equals 1. So that works pretty nicely. So that's how I would handle number 1. Now let's look at number 2. When we look at number 2, well, factoring, quadratic formula, or completing the square. Well, man, as soon as I look here and see this, did you realize it's already in the right form to complete the square? So I would complete the square. We would say x squared minus 2x plus c, remember we got to find it, equals 1 plus c, and then we'd finish the job just like we did last week. So now you could make it equal 0 and use quadratic formula, but I don't think factoring will work on number 2. So let's look at number 3. Well, when I look at number 3, what form idea of factoring would work the best. Oh, did you notice that we have a GCF? We do. So I'm going to use factoring. Factoring is going to work really well because I can factor out my GCF, which is x, and then we've got 8x plus 11 equals 0. We're going to go back to that zero product property. So each part equals 0, so x equals 0. And here we've got x plus 11 equals 0. Here we get x equals negative 11 over 8. Okay, works out pretty nicely. Now, let's look at number 4. When I look at number 4, wow. Will factoring work on that one? Wow, there's no way I can take the factors of 2 and get 7, so factoring's not going to work. How about completing the square? Well, b's odd, so I don't think I want to go there. So for number 4, I would just go and use quadratic formula to get the job done. Now, let's look at number 5. If you look at number 5, there's really only one choice for me to solve that equation. Did you notice I got x squared, x parentheses squared? So here we've got to use square roots. We've got to solve perfect square by using square roots. So we take the square root of both sides, and remember we'd have x minus 2 equals. Remember what we got to put in front of the square root of 7? Plus or minus the square root of 7. Whoops, I didn't put the root around there. Let me write that again. That didn't work out too well. All right, so we would say plus or minus the square root of 7, and then we'd finish the job. Okay, now let's look at number 6. When I look at number 6, well, first of all, I could complete the square because this is even, but it's not in the right form. So we would have to subtract 1 to the other side. X squared minus 8x equals 2, and we could complete the square. So here we could complete the square, or we can make it equal 0. If we made it equal 0, we would have x squared minus 8x minus 2 equals 0, and then you could use quadratic formula. But factoring wouldn't work on that one. There's no way we could take the factors of 2 and get 8. Okay, now, when I get to number 7, as soon as I see all those big numbers there, sometimes instead of just messing around with it, I will just use quadratic factor and go. And then if we look at number 8, now, some students might automatically say quadratic formula on that one, but number 8 will also factor. So sometimes it's a little bit of testing and guessing to see if we can get them to work. So your mission is to decide, what am I going to do with what to do when? How am I going to answer these questions? So let's look at a few. Let's go ahead and pull out that note sheet that I gave you today, and let's look at a few problems and decide what to do. If we looked at number 1, and it says x squared plus 3x plus 2 equals 0. Okay, so when I look at that one, I don't think I'm going to try completing the square because I've got b is an odd number. Will it factor? It sure will. We'd have x plus 2, x plus 1 equals 0. So we have x equals negative 2 and x equals negative 1. Let's look at number 4. If we look at number 4, it looks like this: 6x squared minus 12x equals 0. Well, that looks just like on our chart for factoring. Did you notice I have a GCF? So let's factor out a 6 and an x, and we're left with x minus 2 equals 0. Once again, if the whole thing equals 0, each part equals 0. So we've got 6x equals 0, so x equals 0. And x minus 2 equals 0, so x equals 2. What would happen on number 10? If you look at number 10, it says x minus 2 squared equals 9. Well, just about the only way I can take care of that one would be square roots, because we got parentheses squared, so we're going to take the square root of both sides. X minus 2 equals plus or minus 3. X equals 2 plus or minus 3. So x equals 5. 2 plus 3 is 5. And 2 minus 3 is negative 1. Everybody look at number 13. Everybody look at number 13. When I look at number 13, it looks like this. We've got x squared minus 4x equals 12. Now, did you notice right away that that's in the right form to complete the square? Yeah, so let's try it. We've got x squared minus 4x plus c. We've got to complete the square. And remember, what we add to one side, we add to the other. Well, remember, c equals b over 2 squared. So that's going to be 4 over 2 squared. 4 over 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. What I add to one side, I add to the other. Now, let's go ahead and figure out my binomial squared. Okay, remember, we made that become a binomial squared. And we add those and we get 16. All right, now I've got to take the square root of both sides. So x minus 2 equals plus or minus 4. Don't forget plus or minus. X equals 2 plus or minus 4. So therefore, we've got x equals 2 plus 4, which is 6, and 2 minus 4, which is negative 2. Now, let's say you saw that problem and you said you didn't catch that you could use completing the square. Well, before I can factor, or before I can use quadratic formula, it's got to equal 0. So that's the first thing I do. X squared minus 4x minus 12 equals 0. And then when we look at this one, well, it actually will factor if you look at it. We've got x and x. One is plus and one is minus. What factors of 12 are we going to use? That's right, we're going to do 6 and 2. Again, we're going to x factor to make sure we have chosen wisely, and we have. And so now we've got x plus 2, x minus 6 equals 0, so x equals negative 2, and x equals 6. Did you notice I got the same answer? Now, let's say instead you decided, no, I'm going to use quadratic formula. So once again, we got our equation where it equals 0. Remember, before I can factor or before I can use quadratic equation, it has to equal 0. Okay, so A equals 1, B equals negative 4, and C equals negative 12. Do you remember quadratic formula? X equals the opposite of b. Well, our b is negative 4, so we're going to get positive 4, plus or minus the square root, b squared minus 4a all over 2a. So remember last night's homework, we made sure it equaled 0. We figured out what a, b, and c were, and we plugged everybody in. So now I've got x equals 4 plus or minus. Let's see what's in our radical. Negative 4 squared is 16. Negative times a negative is a positive 48. Okay, so what's 48 and 16? 48 plus 16, 14, 4, 5, 6, 64. Square root of 64 over 2. Well, 64 is a perfect square, so we can say x equals 4 plus or minus 8 over 2. And if we figure out our two answers, we're going to have 4 plus 8, which is 12 over 2, which equals 6. And then we've got to do 4 minus 8, which is negative 4 over 2, which equals negative 2. So if you notice, I got the same answer, but I did the problem using 3 different methods. So tomorrow, you need to choose your method and then solve using that method.